There is a moment, and you can find it if you look hard enough in the old Viennese accounts, when the sentries on the walls of Vienna first see it. July 1683. The air is heavy, midsummer, the kind of heat that sits on stone and doesn't move. And the guard on the southern bastions, some militiaman, some baker or clerk who'd been handed a musket 3 days ago, looks out past the cleared ground, past the glacis, past the vineyards that had been cut down and burned, and he sees a brown smudge on the horizon, south and east, low against the sky, like a storm that's moving the wrong direction. It isn't a storm. That smudge is dust, kicked up by hooves, by boots, by the wheels of gun carriages and the feet of camels. It's the forward edge of the largest army anyone in Europe has ever seen in their lives. 150,000 men, give or take. Crimean Tatar horsemen ranging ahead, burning everything they touch. And behind them, stretching back along the roads of Hungary, in a column so long that the rear guard is still marching when the vanguard has already made camp. The full military power of the Ottoman Empire, coming for this city, coming for these walls. And here's the thing no one on those walls knows yet. The man leading that army, he wasn't supposed to be here. His Sultan didn't send him to Vienna. His generals told him not to come. He came anyway. He lied to his master, overruled his officers, and bet everything, his career, his life, the fate of an empire, on the idea that this city would simply open its gates and hand him the keys. He was wrong, but we'll get to that. To understand how one man's ambition brought 150,000 soldiers to the gates of Vienna, you first have to understand what the Ottoman Empire was in the late 17th century. Not what we think it was, not the sick man of Europe it would become 2 centuries later. What it actually was in 1683. It was the largest and most powerful state on the planet. 5.2 million square kilometers, 3 continents, from Algeria to Iraq, from the gates of Yemen to the plains of Hungary, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, Ottoman, Egypt and the Nile, Ottoman, Greece, the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, Ottoman, the Crimean Khanate stretching into the Ukrainian steppe, a vassal. By 1682, even a Hungarian rebel king had pledged allegiance to the Sultan and been given a crown in return. The border with Christian Europe ran through Hungary, about 150 kilometers from Vienna. That's roughly the distance from New York to Philadelphia. The edge of the Ottoman world was that close. And behind that border stood a military machine unlike anything else on earth. The Janissaries, the Janissaries, the new soldiers, were one of the first professional standing armies in the world. 40 to 50,000 men. They wore brightly colored tunics and tall white felt hats with a spoon-shaped ornament at the front. And if that sounds strange, keep in mind that their entire organizational structure was built around the metaphor of the kitchen. Their officers had titles like head cook and head soup maker. Their regimental standard was a copper cauldron. Overturning that cauldron was the traditional signal for a Janissary revolt, which tells you something about what the empire feared most. They carried flintlock muskets, sabers, short curved daggers called Hansars, pistols. European observers found them physically imposing, well-fed, and terrifying. Their discipline had slipped somewhat from the legendary standards of earlier centuries, but in 1683 they were still the most feared infantry in Europe. And they were produced by one of the strangest institutions in human history, the Devshirme, the child levy. Ottoman officials would tour Christian villages in the Balkans and select boys, aged 7 to 20. The boys were taken from their families. No choice was given. They were brought to Istanbul, converted to Islam, and sorted. The most talented went to the palace school, where they learned Arabic, Persian, Turkish, mathematics, warfare, and administration. The rest went to Janissary training camps. Stop and sit with that for a second. 7 years old, taken from your mother, given a new name, a new faith, a new language, and then trained to kill for the empire that took you. The purpose was coldly brilliant. The Sultan wanted a ruling class that owed everything to him and nothing to their birth families. No hereditary aristocracy, no rival power base, just men whose entire existence was a product of the state. And here is the twist that makes it even stranger. Despite the coercion, some families, including Muslim families who were technically exempt, actually volunteered their sons. Because a boy taken into the devshirme might emerge as a governor, an admiral, a grand vizier, the system was simultaneously a source of immense trauma and extraordinary social mobility. Kara Mustafa himself rose through exactly this kind of network. Now, the thing about empires, and this is true of the Roman Empire, it's true of the Mongol Empire, it's true of every expansionist state that has ever existed, the thing about them is that the ones built on conquest have a problem when the conquering stops. The Ottoman system ran on expansion the way an engine runs on fuel. Cut off the fuel and the engine doesn't idle, it seizes. The Timar system, the backbone of Ottoman military power, worked like this. You conquer new territory, you distribute it as land grants to cavalrymen called sipahi. In exchange for the revenue from that land, the sipahi maintain themselves, their horses, their weapons, their armed retainers, and they show up when the Sultan calls them to war. Conquer more land, distribute more grants, raise more cavalry. It's elegant, it's self-sustaining, and it only works if you keep conquering. Stop expanding, and those sipahi sit on stagnant fiefs with no new land to claim. The Janissaries, the elite infantry, 40 to 50,000 of the finest professional soldiers in the world, they need campaigns to justify their pay. The treasury needs the spoils of war because the Ottoman state spent like an empire that expected to keep winning. So what happens when you stop? Between 1644 and 1656, the empire found out. Sultan Ibrahim I was deposed and strangled. His son, Mehmed IV, was put on the throne at the age of 6 years old. The Queen Mother ruled as regent while factions in the palace tore at each other. Janissaries revolted. The treasury collapsed. Venetian warships blockaded the Dardanelles. Grand viziers were appointed and replaced and sometimes killed so fast it was hard to keep count. The machine was starving, and a starving machine doesn't sit quietly. It thrashes. Now, I need to take you back 154 years, because what happened at Vienna in 1683 doesn't make sense unless you understand what happened at Vienna in 1529. Suleiman the Magnificent. If you know one Ottoman Sultan's name, it's probably his. In 1529, he was the most formidable ruler in the world, richer than any European monarch, commanding a larger army than any European monarch. And in 1526, his forces had destroyed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs so completely that the King of Hungary drowned, fleeing the battlefield. Hungary was his, and now Suleiman wanted what was behind Hungary. He marched out of Istanbul in May of 1529 with over 100,000 men. But the spring rains that year were catastrophic. Rivers overflowed, roads turned to swamps, and the heavy siege cannons, the enormous bronze guns that could shatter fortress walls, they got stuck. Oxen couldn't haul them through the muck. Suleiman was forced to abandon his heavy artillery in the mud and press on with lighter guns that simply couldn't do the job. He reached Vienna in late September, 21,000 defenders against 100,000 attackers. The Ottomans tried mining operations. They detonated charges that breached sections of the wall. The final assault went in on October 14th. Extra rewards were offered to every soldier who reached the top. They were beaten back. The next day, with winter closing in and supplies running low, Suleiman called it off. The retreat was brutal. Horses and camels dying in the mud, thousands of men lost to cold and exhaustion, 16,000 Ottoman dead. The greatest sultan who ever lived turned away from a city he couldn't crack. And the reason he couldn't crack it was simple. He didn't have his big guns. File that away. It's going to matter. The 1529 siege did something that can't be undone. It planted Vienna in the Ottoman imagination as the unfinished business of the greatest conqueror in their history. The Ottomans had a term for it, the Kizil Elma, the red apple. It was a mythical concept, a shifting symbol, the next great Christian prize to be taken, the city that would prove Islamic supremacy once and for all. Before 1453, the red apple was Constantinople. Mehmed II took it and the apple moved. After 1521, when Suleiman captured Belgrade, it moved again. By the 1680s, the red apple was Vienna, the golden apple of the Germans, the one that got away. And every ambitious Ottoman commander knew it. So the empire is in crisis in the 1650s. The Sultan is a child. The state is eating itself. And into this chaos steps one of the most remarkable political families in Ottoman history. In September 1656, the Queen Mother Turhan Sultan, desperate, out of options, appointed a 71-year-old Albanian bureaucrat named Koprulu Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier. 71, effectively retired. And this old man did something that no Grand Vizier in Ottoman history had ever done. He looked at the chaos around him and he said, in effect, "I'll fix this, but I have conditions." His conditions were extraordinary. The Sultan would issue no commands based on any communication that didn't come through the Grand Vizier. No official would act independently of him. He would make all appointments, and the Sultan was to ignore any accusations made against him, no matter who made them or what they said. Total authority. In everything but title, Koprulu Mehmed Pasha became the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. Turhan Sultan accepted, and then the old man went to work. Mass executions of conspirators, purges of corrupt officials, Janissary mutineers crushed, the treasury refilled. It was brutal, it was ruthless, and it worked. The empire stabilized. The Venetian blockade was broken. The machinery of state ground back to life. When Koprulu Mehmed died in 1661, his son Fazil Ahmed took over, making the Grand Vizierate effectively hereditary. And Fazil Ahmed was brilliant. He conquered Crete from Venice. He seized Kamianets-Podilski from Poland. He took fortress after fortress in Hungary. 15 years of sustained military success. And then Fazil Ahmed died in 1676. And the question became, who inherits this dynasty? The answer was his brother-in-law, a man who had been adopted into the Koprulu household as a boy, a man who had married Koprulu Mehmed's daughter, served as Fazil Ahmed's deputy, watched and learned and waited. His name was Kara Mustafa Pasha. Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, Black Mustafa of Merzifon, born around 1634 in a village in northern Anatolia. His father was a sipahi, a provincial cavalryman, modest background, not a great family. But somehow, whether through the formal devshirme or through informal patronage, scholars still debate this, somehow the boy Mustafa entered the Koprulu household, and once inside that orbit, he rose. Governor of Silistria, a string of provincial posts, deputy to the Grand Vizier, and then, in 1676, at roughly 42 years old, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man in the world below the Sultan himself. That's the resume. Now let me tell you what the man was actually like. European diplomats who dealt with him left remarkably consistent accounts. And I should note, these are hostile sources. These are men who suffered his treatment. But the picture they paint is detailed, and it comes from multiple directions. They called him, and I'm quoting here, greedy, humorous but terse, avid, intransigent, perfidious, covetous, and completely devoted to the Ottoman state. That last part is easy to miss. Completely devoted to the state. Even his enemies saw that. This was not a man who was simply out for himself. He was out for himself and the empire simultaneously. And in his mind, there was no contradiction between the two. The historian Thomas Barker, writing in the 1960s, described Kara Mustafa's methods as defined by dissimulation and deceit. His anger at the slightest opposition might cause him to burst into uncontrolled rage. He extorted massive bribes from foreign ambassadors, treated Western diplomats with open contempt, made absolutely no effort to hide his disdain for the Christian powers. And the ambition. Every source converges on this. Kara Mustafa did not want a successful campaign. He did not want a good war. He wanted the war. The conquest that would make his name greater than any Koprulu before him, greater perhaps than Suleiman himself. Some historians believe he intended to set himself up as the governor, effectively the independent ruler, of all of Western and Central Europe once it fell. Others suggest he was thinking even beyond that. After Vienna, Rome, the seat of the Pope, the ultimate red apple. That's not ambition, that's appetite. And there's a difference. Now, some modern Turkish scholars have pushed back on the caricature. They argue that his arrogance toward European diplomats was calculated statecraft, not merely a personality defect. That he was defending Ottoman interests against manipulative foreign powers. And there's probably some truth in that. But the ambition? That part nobody disputes. You cannot understand this story without understanding the man who was supposed to be in charge, Sultan Mehmed IV. He'd been put on the throne at the age of 6, remember. Grew up in a palace where his grandmother was strangled in a harem conspiracy, where grand viziers were appointed and killed so casually it must have seemed like weather. By the time he was old enough to actually rule, the Koprulu grand viziers had taken control of everything that mattered, and Mehmed IV did not seem to mind. He earned the nickname Avci Mehmed, Mehmed the Hunter. It was not a term of respect. The man was obsessed with hunting. He spent most of his time at his hunting grounds near Edirne, which became a kind of second capital. He hunted while his Grand Viziers governed. He hunted while his armies fought. He hunted while the fate of his empire was being decided by men whose names he may not have even known. And this is the structural problem. The Ottoman system concentrated enormous power in the Sultan and then delegated that power to the Grand Vizier. Under the competent Koprulus, this worked. The Sultan hunted, the Vizier governed, and things got done. But the system only works if the man at the top is paying attention, if there's a check on the Vizier's power. A moment where the Sultan says no. Mehmed IV wasn't paying attention. He wasn't saying no. He wasn't saying much of anything unless it involved falcons. And that vacuum, that absence at the top, is what made everything that follows possible. August 6, 1682, Istanbul, the Sultan's great palace. John Stoy, in his classic account of the siege, describes the scene. On 6 August 1682, an important meeting took place in Sultan Mehmed IV's great palace in Istanbul. The highest officers of his government were present, and those among them who opposed the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa for personal reasons or deplored his aggressive statesmanship had been silenced. Silenced. That's a word that does a lot of work in Ottoman politics. It doesn't necessarily mean killed. Sometimes it means transferred to a distant province. Sometimes it means financially ruined. Sometimes it means exactly what it sounds like. At this council, the empire made two decisions. First, they would disregard the existing peace treaty with Emperor Leopold I of Austria, a treaty that wasn't even due to expire until 1684. Second, they would launch a major military campaign into Hungary in 1683 with the full military strength of the empire. And here is where the deception begins. Kara Mustafa told the Sultan that the campaign would target two fortresses in northwestern Hungary, Győr and Komárom, important positions, strategically valuable, but limited in scope. A border campaign, the kind of thing the Ottoman army had done a dozen times before. The Sultan approved. War was formally declared. Mobilization orders went out across the empire, from North Africa to Mesopotamia, from the Balkans to Arabia. Troops began to move. Fast forward to May 1683, Belgrade. The army has assembled, 100,000 men, with more arriving. On May 13th, Sultan Mehmed IV rides out for a grand military review. He proclaims a holy war against the Christian enemy. And then comes the ceremony that changes everything. The Sultan hands over the flag of the Prophet, the Sanjaki Serif, to Kara Mustafa. It was a copy. The original had reportedly been captured by the Venetians at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. But its symbolic weight was enormous. It meant the Sultan was delegating his authority as commander of the faithful to his Grand Vizier. Supreme command, total military authority. The word of the Grand Vizier was now the word of the Sultan. And then Mehmed IV did what Mehmed IV always did. He stayed behind, remained in Belgrade, went hunting. Imagine you are Kara Mustafa in that moment. The Sultan is behind you. 100,000 soldiers are in front of you. The sacred banner is in your hands. And the target you told your master you were aiming for, the target he approved, is not the target you intend to hit. The army marches north. By June 2nd, they've crossed the Drava River at Osijek. They are deep into Hungary now. And in late June, as the army approaches Győr, one of the two fortresses the Sultan had authorized as targets, Kara Mustafa issues an order that no one expects. Bypass it. Keep marching. His generals are stunned. Ibrahim Pasha, the governor of Buda, the man who knew the Hungarian frontier better than anyone alive, he protests. The warnings pour in from senior commanders. Vienna's fortifications are among the strongest in Europe. The distance is too great. Every day spent besieging a city that deep in enemy territory is a day the Habsburgs can use to assemble a relief army. And the Sultan never authorized this. Kara Mustafa overruled them all. He carried the flag of the Prophet. No one could countermand him except the Sultan. And the Sultan was in Belgrade, hunting. Think about what that means. A subordinate has hijacked the military campaign of the most powerful empire on earth. 150,000 men are now committed to a target their sovereign never approved. And the man who made this decision understands something very clearly. If Vienna falls, he is the greatest conqueror since Mehmed II took Constantinople. If Vienna does not fall, the Sultan will find out what happened. And the punishment for a Grand Vizier who deceives his master is a silk cord around the throat. There is no middle ground, Vienna or death. Kara Mustafa was reckless, but he was not stupid. He had reasons to believe this gamble would pay off. And honestly, looking at the diplomatic landscape of 1683, his reasoning wasn't bad. Start with France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, had made a cold calculation. The Habsburgs were his principal rival. They controlled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, most of Central Europe. Anything that weakened the Habsburgs strengthened France. So when the Pope begged Louis to send troops to help defend Vienna, Louis refused. He didn't just refuse, he used the Ottoman invasion as cover to seize Strasbourg and other territories along the Rhine, while Habsburg attention was pointed the other way. Read that again. The most powerful Christian king in Europe watched a fellow Christian capital face annihilation and saw nothing but an opportunity for a land grab. That's 17th century geopolitics for you. Then there was Hungary itself. Imre Tokoli, a Protestant Hungarian nobleman whose father had been executed by the Habsburgs, was leading a full-scale rebellion against Austrian rule. In 1682, Sultan Mehmed had recognized Tokoli as King of Upper Hungary under Ottoman protection. Tokoli's rebels were tying down Habsburg forces, providing intelligence, proving that the Christian frontier was already crumbling from the inside. Multiple sources say it was largely at Tokoli's instigation that the Sultan had approved the campaign in the first place. So from where Kara Mustafa stood, France was neutral. Hungary was in revolt. The Habsburg Emperor was fighting on multiple fronts with a depleted treasury. Vienna would be isolated. No allies, no time, no army big enough to break a siege. The city would surrender, quickly and with its wealth intact. That was the plan, and the plan had a logic to it. What the plan did not account for was a 60-year-old pope with a vision and a very large checkbook. Pope Innocent XI had been working for months, quietly, urgently, to build a coalition. On March 31, 1683, before the campaign even started, the Treaty of Warsaw was signed. Poland pledged to relieve Vienna if it was attacked. In exchange, papal money flowed north. 300,000 florins a year to Leopold, 200,000 imperial thalers to Poland, and within a single year, over 1.5 million florins to Poland alone. Kara Mustafa knew about French neutrality. He knew about the Hungarian rebellion. What he did not know, or chose to dismiss, was that the other half of Europe was already mobilizing against him. He was betting on a divided Christendom. He was half right, but half right in a siege is the same as wrong. And now we arrive at the decision that doomed everything. The decision that echoes across 154 years of Ottoman history and lands with a sound like a door slamming shut. Kara Mustafa did not bring heavy siege artillery to Vienna. I want you to sit with that for a moment. He marched the largest army in Europe against one of the most heavily fortified cities on the continent, and he left behind the guns that could break the walls. The army carried light field guns, weapons good enough for a battlefield, but completely inadequate against the massive bastioned fortifications of a city like Vienna. The enormous bronze siege cannons, the weapons that could shatter stone walls into rubble, were either left behind or sent on barges up the Danube that never arrived in time. Why? There are 4 explanations, and none of them cancel each other out. Speed. Heavy siege guns weigh tons. They move at the pace of oxen. Bringing them would have slowed the march by weeks. Weeks that would give Leopold time to organize a defense. Kara Mustafa wanted to move fast, arrive before anyone was ready, and present Vienna with an overwhelming fait accompli. History. Suleiman the Magnificent had tried to bring his heavy guns in 1529 and lost them in the mud. The roads of Hungary were terrible. Maybe Kara Mustafa decided it was better to leave them behind on purpose than to lose them by accident, the way his predecessor had. Overconfidence. He genuinely believed Vienna would capitulate. A city of 60,000 civilians staring at 150,000 soldiers? They would do the math. They would open the gates. Why drag cannons across Hungary for a siege that wouldn't happen? And then there is the 4th reason, greed. If Vienna fell by assault, if Ottoman troops stormed the walls and took the city by force, military tradition granted the soldiers the right of plunder. The army would loot everything. The gold, the silver, the treasuries, the palaces, all of it would be divided among the troops. But if the city surrendered, the wealth belonged to the Grand Vizier and the state treasury. Ottoman chroniclers themselves pointed to this. They attributed the failure at Vienna in part to, and I'm paraphrasing their language, poor planning that prioritized personal reward over military reality. Kara Mustafa wanted the city whole. He wanted it rich. He wanted its wealth for himself. Speed, history, overconfidence, and greed. Take your pick. Or take all 4. The result was the same. The largest army in Europe arrived at the strongest fortress in Central Europe without the means to break it. April 1, 1683. The forward elements of the Ottoman army depart Edirne, Across Thrace, across the Balkans, the column stretches for miles. Infantry, cavalry, camels, supply wagons, camp followers, engineers, miners, armorers, cooks. Early May, Belgrade, the Grand Review, the Holy War declared, the banner transferred, the Sultan stays behind. June 2nd, the army crosses the Drava River at Osijek. They are deep in Hungary now. Kara Mustafa reveals the true target. His generals protest. He overrules them. And ahead of the main army, moving fast and burning everything in their path, ride the Crimean Tatars. 25 to 40,000 light cavalrymen, the finest irregular horsemen in the world, sweeping across the Austrian countryside in a wave of fire and terror. The villages around Vienna burn. Populations are killed or enslaved. Refugees flood into the city and onto the roads west. And one incident in particular changes the entire nature of the campaign. Perchtoldsdorf, a town just south of Vienna. The inhabitants hear the Tatars are coming and they do the rational thing. They surrender. They open the gates. They trust in Ottoman promises of mercy. They are massacred, killed or enslaved, every one of them, despite the surrender terms. That single act, that broken promise at one small town, rewrote the entire siege. After Perchtoldsdorf, no one in Vienna believes a word about Ottoman mercy. Surrender means death. The only option left is to fight. On July 7th, Emperor Leopold I makes a decision that will be debated for centuries. He flees, takes his court and 60,000 Viennese civilians, and heads west for Passau. Duke Charles of Lorraine pulls his 20,000-man field army back toward Linz. Just think about that scene for a moment. The roads west of Vienna, clogged with 60,000 civilians, carts piled with whatever people could carry, children, the elderly, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire somewhere in the middle of it, riding away from his own capital. And behind them, the smoke rising from every village the Tatars have burned. The city is left in the hands of one man, Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, military commander of the garrison. 15,000 troops, some regulars, some militia, some armed civilians who a month ago were shopkeepers. 15,000 against 150,000, 10 to 1. Picture this. You're standing on the southern bastion of Vienna on July 14th, 1683. You are Starhemberg, or one of his officers, or one of those bakers with a musket, and you're looking out at something that doesn't quite seem real. The Ottoman camp spreads out before you, and it is not a military camp. It is a city. Marketplaces, forges, stables, hospitals, thousands upon thousands of tents arranged in geometric precision as far as you can see. Jan Sobieski, the king of Poland, would later describe it, after he saw it with his own eyes, as large as Warsaw or Lvov within the walls. He counted, by his estimate, 100,000 tents at least. And at the center of that canvas city, one tent larger than the rest, Kara Mustafa's personal command tent, described by those who later entered it as a palace of silk and gold, with baths, fountains, servants, lavish furnishings. The Grand Vizier lived in the field the way he lived in Istanbul, surrounded by luxury that would have been recognizable to a European king. On July 14th, a messenger rides toward the walls under a flag of truce. He carries Kara Mustafa's demand: surrender the city. Starhemberg's answer is no. He has a specific reason beyond duty and honor. Perchtoldsdorf, the massacre. Every man on those walls knows what happened to the town that surrendered. Every man on those walls knows what Ottoman mercy looks like when the gates are open. So the gates stay closed. By July 17th, the defenders have cleared the glacis, the open ground outside the walls, into a killing field. Any Ottoman soldier who crosses that ground does it under fire from every direction. Kara Mustafa orders trenches dug. Approach works, zigzagging toward the walls, providing cover for his troops to get closer without being torn apart. And below ground, below the killing field, below the trenches, below the walls themselves, his engineers begin to dig. The Lagimçiler, Ottoman military miners, some of the best siege engineers in the world. They start tunneling under the fortifications, packing the tunnels with gunpowder, preparing to blast the walls from beneath. It will work, eventually. Mining can bring down walls. The Ottomans know how to do it, but it is slow, desperately, agonizingly slow. Every day the miners dig is another day the Habsburgs have to assemble a relief army. Every day is another day for the Pope's money to buy Polish lances. Every day is another day that the clock ticks against the man who left his siege guns behind. So let me bring this back to where we started. That dust cloud on the horizon, that baker on the wall with his musket. By mid-July 1683, the situation is this. The largest army Europe has seen in living memory is encamped outside the walls of Vienna. Inside those walls, walls, 15,000 men are preparing to fight a force 10 times their size. The emperor has fled, the field army has withdrawn, the city is alone. And the man responsible for all of it, Kara Mustafa Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, heir to the Koprulu dynasty, holder of the flag of the Prophet, is staring at a problem he created for himself. He has no heavy guns to break the walls. He deceived his sultan to get here. His generals warned him and he ignored them. He is counting on a city to surrender, and the city has decided to die fighting instead, because his own soldiers massacred the last town that surrendered. He is betting that no relief force will arrive in time, and he is wrong about that too, because a coalition he underestimated is already assembling. Every single advantage he thought he had is dissolving, and the one thing he cannot do, the one thing that is absolutely impossible for Kara Mustafa Pasha, is turn around and go home. Because going home means facing a sultan who will ask a very simple question. Why did you go to Vienna when I told you to take Győr? And there is only one answer to that question, and it involves a green silk cord. The trap is perfect, it's just not the trap he planned. Vienna will not surrender, the guns are not coming, the Polish cavalry is already saddling up, and underground, the miners are digging, slowly, slowly, while the clock runs out. That is where we leave it. Kara Mustafa, the Koprulu heir, the man who would be greater than Suleyman, standing in his tent of silk and gold, staring at walls he cannot break. The red apple is right there, close enough to touch, he just can't quite reach it. There's a lesson in this, and it's not just about the Ottomans. It's about what happens when a system designed for perpetual motion meets an obstacle it cannot move. The empire needed to expand. The Grand Vizier needed a triumph. The army needed a war. Everything was pushing in one direction. Forward, forward, always forward. And no one had the authority or the courage to say stop. Suleyman the Magnificent lost his guns in the mud. 154 years later, Kara Mustafa left his behind on purpose. Two men, separated by 6 generations, both standing before the same walls with the same problem. One was unlucky, the other chose to be. And that might be the cruelest part of this whole story. It wasn't fate, it was a choice. Next time on the gates of Vienna, the siege. 60 days of mining, countermining, and slaughter. The walls start to crack. Starnberg is wounded. The city begins to starve. And from the north, moving faster than anyone thought possible, comes Jan Sobieski and the largest cavalry charge in history. I'm Basil. Thank you for listening.